original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we are. It is the 23rd day of October as we record this session of Now and Next. Welcome in. Lots going on this week. We're going to get to a number of the stories that flared up in the headlines. And I think in some cases, there are stories here that kind of make, I hadn't thought of that. So, it's kind of the second thing that comes to mind session as well. So we're going to get to our crew. We've got the CA.S.T, our communications and strategy team in here we want to talk about. But before we do that, I just want to touch on a story that we talked about on the Ledge last week. And that was when we were in studio with Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, John Wright, and Keith Leslie. And we were talking about a number of things, all provincial politics, as we are wont to do. And among other things, we got into a discussion about paper bags coming back to the LCBO. And I started off on a rant because this file only makes it clear to me that, first of all, the LCBO has no fucking idea what paper bags mean to the environment. That by banning paper bags, you do not save trees. You don't. Because we make paper bags out of the scrub and everything else that's not usable when we cut down a tree. And if you don't use it, it rots, it sits in the bush, either creates tinder for forest fires, or just emits carbon back into the air because the trees actually capture carbon. So it's clear to me they haven't got a bloody clue what all that means. The Premier, though, of course, came out in April and said, we're going to fix the problem because we need to make it more affordable for Ontarians to go to the liquor store. Basically is what he said. So we're going to actually bring the paper bags back. Here's the problem. When they canceled the paper bags, the company that was involved went elsewhere. They didn't have anybody to backfill now. So the LCBO did what the LCBO had to do. They had to go to procurement. They had to go out there and find a company that was going to manufacture paper bags so that we would all not feel stigmatized when we walked out of the liquor store with a bottle, under our arm. They find the team that they want to do this. They put out the tender. They go through the process. They hire a manufacturing company. And the news last week is, from our friends at Global, you can see Colin DeMello there, wrote the story. And he pointed out that the company that got the contract was from Quebec. So I was just curious to see whether or not they were the company that was actually going in and working at the pulp and paper level, or were they taking the material and processing it? Well, it turns out they were just the manufacturing and the processing company. But when I went to their website and I looked up the company's called Rosenblum. Well, interestingly, now Rosenblum is now Pro-Am-Pac. And I thought, well, what the heck is Pro-Am-Pac? Pro-Am-Pac is another packaging company that has acquired Rosenblum. So now we find out today that the province is pushing back because it's not an Ontario manufacturer. They said it's a Quebec manufacturer. Got news for you. Pro-Am-Pac is based in the United States. So they have actually gone out to tender and they have awarded the contract not to a Canadian company, not to a Quebec company, not to an Ontario company, but to a U.S. company. And this slid right by. I'm telling you, it took me 10, 15 minutes to figure this out. How rigorous could the procurement process actually be in terms of finding out who the province and who the LCBO is doing business with? I'm just asking. I know it's not up there on the scale of the Greenbelt scandal. I get that. But at the same time, it just makes me wonder who the hell is running the shop when you get to those kinds of things. All right, so this week, fun and games in Ottawa again. And this has nothing to do with the missive that the PM is entertaining, probably as we speak, as we record, that there's a revolt in the room. The crisis is coming from inside the House. This time, it was the CBC President and CEO, Katherine Tate, back in front of the Parliamentary Heritage Committee. And the headlines that came out of it didn't do her or the CBC any favors of late. Essentially, she accused the MPs, particularly the Conservatives around the table, of vilifying her and the national broadcaster.
Having experienced now the third appearance at this committee, I would say that there is a clear effort on the part of members of this committee to vilify and to discredit me and to discredit the organization. Not one question has been asked, not one question has been asked about the accomplishments of the public broadcaster over the last 6 years and how we have served
I think
Canadians.
our Liberal colleagues have asked you some of those questions, so I think that's not a fair representation of your time here today. But let's go back to something that our colleague Mr. Coteau asked you earlier. You referred to KPIs, key performance indicators. Would the idea that a growing movement in our country would like to defund your organization be weighed into an analysis of key performance indicators and determining whether the discretionary portions of the bonuses that you've acknowledged there is a percentage that is discretionary and not contractually obligated, that those percentages that you might consider, if people don't like what we're doing, if people don't trust us, if people would like the government to take money away from our bloated organization, maybe we shouldn't be spending more of their money than we have to. Could that not cross your mind in analyzing the KPIs?
We do not take into consideration political wins or influences in determining our business metrics.
So you would call it a political reaction for the average Canadian to hear that you're doling out $18 million in bonuses, that you're billing the taxpayer for your time in Paris while on a personal vacation. That's a political concern that the average Canadian wouldn't have a pure interest in that based purely on the fact that they are giving you their hard-earned money through taxes?
I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at on this question.
30 seconds, please.
You're trying to marginalize legitimate concerns about abuse of taxpayer dollars and any accountability that we are trying as parliamentarians to introduce here, and you're saying it's purely political. And what I'm saying is the big, beautiful, growing movement to defund the CBC is not a purely political movement, but it is a matter of taxpayer accountability. Can you not acknowledge that?
I will not, Madam Chair, I will not be accused of abusing taxpayer dollars. I'm sorry, for the record. We have managed our budget extremely carefully. We were facing $100 million.
I don't think the Canadian people would agree with you.
All right. Well, fiery and feisty, and that was only a part of the exchange. So, and I played the whole thing for the purposes of this being long-form conversation, and I think the context is important. So, joined this morning by Anne-Marie Aikens, Lindsay Broadhead is here, Brad Ross, Bob Reed, and Brad, you were the one that brought it to the table. Riff.
There's an adage in our business.
Heavy sigh.
There's an adage in our business is you don't repeat negatives. I love this one, though. I will not be accused of abusing taxpayer dollars. Well, you just were. And so the inability to read a committee room is astonishing to me by the president of the CBC, a communications corporation whose president and CEO isn't doing the communications bit very well at all. As you noted, this is Katherine Tate's third or fourth appearance before this committee. Continues to be frankly vilified. It is these committee hearings are political. Of course, we all know that Pierre Poilievre has threatened to quote unquote defund the CBC. It's not clear to me exactly what that means, but why Tait is going in and arguing as she is when she's on her way out. In fact, I think they just named her replacement. And you said off the top, Dave, she's not doing the CBC any favors. The CBC is a critical in my view anyway, broadcaster, critical to stitching this country together. And her appearances before this committee continue to make news for all the wrong reasons.
Exactly, Anne-Marie. I mean, the last time she was there, she was trying to justify the bonuses that were being paid to executive teams when they had just laid off, hundreds of employees and journalists. Again, I can only imagine. A friend of mine has just taken a new gig at the CBC. And, given the way other media is working, it might be the safest place right now in some cases. But I can only imagine that the crew who works at the CBC are just saying to her, shut up, leave the table.
Yeah, I think she, as Brad said, she did not read that room very well at all. She went into it. She either ignored the advice of her communication advisors or just didn't get it, if she was arrogant enough not to listen to anyone. But I think the mistake was made long before. You can't win this argument about getting $1 million bonuses. You just can't. There is no defense of it when you're using taxpayer dollars. And in fact, it was bonuses were eliminated from most public servant jobs. There's a few, and I think we've been talking about that of late, that build transit that still get big, hefty bonuses based on apparently by performance. And that you just can't win the argument. There is no defense for it, and they should have known that when they were paying out the hefty bonuses. And then once she got into that room, she should have been reading the room much more carefully, listening to some communications advice, and having a bit of a sense of a regret about paying off those bonuses. And they should be thinking about changing them going forward.
Well, Bob, it's not as if she had the opportunity here to leave gracefully. This was scorched earth retreat.
Mm-hmm. Sure was. And we're all speculating as to what she was possibly thinking. And to be charitable, maybe she thought, this is my last hurrah here. I'm already on my way out of the organization. I'm going to take one for the team. I'm not going down without a fight. And I'm going to go in there and I'm going to tell Jamil Jivani and everybody else on that committee exactly what for. Brad opened with the maxim of you never repeat the negative. The one that came to mind to me was never mud wrestle with a pig, because the pig rather enjoys it and you both end up getting filthy. And I'm not directing that at any member of the committee. I'm just saying they were spoiling for a fight. Particularly Mr. Jivani he was locked and loaded and was going to take her down. And that's where she misread the room. This was not the place to defend the integrity of the CBC. This was not the place to try and win the argument. This was the place to go in and be boring as hell, be dry as a box of saltines, confine your answers just to the narrow limits of the question, and don't give them anything new to work with, which she did in answer after answer after answer.
Well, the problem, in addition to that, Lindsay, is that she explicitly, inadvertently or not, added more fuel to the fire to let's bail on the CBC, and it's a big cudgel that the Conservatives are going to swing. It's not the right thing to do. You do not want to defund the CBC. Do you need to rethink the CBC? Do you need to reconsider its place in the media landscape? All those things. Yes, you do. But what she did there was actually just lit the fire, and all of a sudden it's self-immolated.
Yeah, that's an understatement, and I think we're all saying a version of the same thing, that two things that are completely polarizing in some regard can both be true, right? It's true that she and the CBC are being vilified. I think that's absolutely true, and she's being puppeteered magically. Jivani, just as a side note, he is amazing at what he did. We're going to see a lot more of him being put out there by the Tories in terms of the attack dog. He was fantastic, articulate, just squarely hit the center of the target each time. But you can be both vilified and also a horrible CEO, right? A really unsuccessful CEO. Her role as the leader, and we've been punting back and forth actually on social media a little bit this week about the role of a CEO. You're supposed to go out there in the hard times and represent not just yourself, but the brand in a way that calms the waters. Everything she did, to my colleague's points here, is she enticed vilification. It's not dissimilar to what Trudeau did when he went on the luxurious holiday, right? It's not that it's wrong. It's not that it's illegal. It's so inept, and it shows no EQ towards what a leader needs to be. That's the difference. And that's what Jamil, I think, was getting at, was optically, Canadians think you're just absolutely unhinged and not in line with what our concerns are, that the CBC needs to perform differently. And here you have a woman who's performing exactly in a way that is in line with what the opposition wants her to do. She's being perfectly puppeteered.
It's a short game, Dave. She played the short game in what is ultimately a long game, especially for the CBC and the change of government coming.
Yeah, I was going to say, wouldn't the strategy, Brad, have been better to say, listen, we know that there are challenges with the media landscape. We know that the CBC has an important role to play in it, and we would encourage a review and a reset and a re-articulation of the CBC vis-a-vis the Canada Broadcast Act, all of those things. Sure. I think, back to Bob's point, I mean, just get really policy-driven and boring. Yeah. But that's where this conversation had to go.
Yeah, make word salads. I don't care. What they've done, though, and what she's done is she's given the Tories clips for whatever campaign, whenever the election campaign comes, with respect to the CBC, and just made it more of a target. She drew them a target and stood there for them. So I don't get it. I really don't.
Well, and I think the larger conversation, again, will have to be about the CBC. Bob, I don't think that this allows that to happen now. I mean, can you imagine what it's going to be like when we seriously get into campaign mode? You've got Melissa Lansman, Jamil Javani, and Pierre Poilievre. There will not be oxygen in the room.
No, the guns will be blazing for sure. And I think Lindsay's right. I think we're going to see a lot more of Jamil Javani in that pit bull attack dog role. I was thinking he's maybe the next Pierre Poilievre in terms of not necessarily future leadership capability, but that was Poilievre's gig, right? He was the attack dog. He was the machine gun who just mowed the opposition down every chance he got. And I think we're going to see more of that, because when you have voices like that in your caucus, yeah, you use them for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be fiery, to say the least. And just as we're chatting here, I've got CTV up, and everybody's going into the caucus room today, and so the more we talk about these things in terms of the strategy and the fire, everything else, that the tone is not going to dial back at all, Anne-Marie. I think as much as we would like to have a conversation where we can all agree that we respect each other's point of view, we're not going there.
No, I think people are looking to their news for entertainment, and the fiery, kind of rhetoric and the negative rhetoric is people find that entertaining. I find that a bit sad, but that's it seems to be what's gaining people's attention. Is it worked in the US, and it's gradually working its way up here, and people seem to be enjoying this really super negative rhetoric. You're right that Jamani said something about the big beautiful momentum that's building against the CBC. He called it a big beautiful, which I thought was an odd way. Yeah, it was really sad, that because you need to have as you said, a really frank, honest, open, adult conversation about the CBC and all of our mainstream media, because they all get funding. CBC is a different entity, but she just didn't invite that. And it's just as the others have said, it's going to be, she gave them quotes and clips that'll be used and overused throughout the campaign. And because that's kind of where we are right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious to get everybody's take on this story that came out of the Globe and Mail this week, and it was Robert Fife doing his Robert Fife thing. The headline, the Globe is reporting that federal officials here in Canada provided intelligence on India to the Washington Post. And the thing that struck me about all of this is that I saw online, Lindsay, all of the complaining about, or how can one news agency out another news agency? Well, they clearly don't understand how the newsrooms work. But in this case, if Bob Fife's reporting is correct, and generally it is, we got to think that there's some really serious, implications here. If we've got the former Deputy Minister of Justice and now the National Security Advisor for the PM involved in somehow leaking what sounds like could be classified information to the Washington Post, don't you think that's the Globe and Mail's job?
It is the Globe and Mail's job, and kudos to Fife for reporting on it in this way. We need to keep having reports coming in this way, because it seems like, I don't know how you all feel. I feel like this is a soup of mess and confusion, and it's hard to read one article without having to go down the rabbit hole of reading about 6 or 7 other articles just to figure out what has happened, where is this going. But between India, foreign interference, all of the players seem faulty, full of holes, full of gaps, and obviously no one on the federal side are playing nice together in the sandbox. So who's the victim? Canadians. Again and again and again, each of us sits here with our papers trying to understand where the truth goes. And it keeps going back to the same place, which I think Fife alluded to, which is there needs to be greater transparency and then opening up of this box somehow, or else we're never going to get to the central truth. And it's something that I think Canadians deserve and should know more about.
Bob, when we look at this all gets tangled up because it all, in terms of the timeline and the Prime Minister's appearance before the Foreign Interference Committee and the things that were said in that, this all just stinks in terms of timing, the play that's going on, the manipulation around the information. And it's hard to take the PM seriously when he chastises other media for coming out with reports that, he claims was classified information on other stories.
Criminal, he called it.
Yeah.
In the past when there've been leaks like this. So that's why this one is so fascinating. When I worked in government, we used to laugh sometimes and say, internally, when is a leak not a leak? When it's a strategic pre-release. And that's what we saw here, because not only was it a high-level leak, we don't have conclusive evidence that it was those 2 high-ranking individuals, but it sure seems like it based on the reporting. They gave a leak to a major American newspaper and did it under embargo, because the fine print in the story says that the information that was passed on was not to be reported until the day of the big Thanksgiving news conference that we had here in Ottawa, and the Post respected that. So I'm looking at trying to break down what was the motivation here, what was at play, because clearly the Trudeau government wanted to have that story play prominently in Washington on the same day. So they gave it not to some schlub reporter, they gave it to the Washington Post. They gave it as an exclusive, guaranteeing that it would get prominent play, as any exclusive does, and did it under embargo, timed with the actual official announcement. And that's probably some CYA in there, because if the Post had reported first, then they've got a real scandal on their hands. But this is still fairly scandalous in terms of the level of the intelligence that was provided in advance to an American media outlet. They got their play out of it. They got what the feds got what they wanted from it. But it's interesting to see, okay, why was that so critically important? Why did they need that to make big news in Washington on that day?
Well, and I think the issue, as to Bob's point, Brett, is that, we're talking about Nathalie Drouin, who is the National Security Advisor for the Prime Minister's office. We're talking about, the Deputy Minister in Global Affairs being implicated in this. Now, whether or not they actually handed the envelope or have passed on the email with the details is beside the point.
Well, so let's take this back to the communications and strategy piece then. I have a Substack I write every week called Hot Takes, and I wrote about this last week, and I wrote about it naively believing that the RCMP and the government of Canada were doing the right thing by us all by announcing some public safety concerns that they had. They held this press on Thanksgiving Day, a very slow news day, because they really wanted to make sure that, that this, they got to do this on this holiday because this is critically important information. Well, for fuck's sakes, what they did was they gave this to the Post, as Bob said, under embargo. So this has been planned long ahead of time. This wasn't a hastily called presser, and I'm not suggesting it would have been, but it was under the guise of public safety. When really what I think what I'm grappling with now is just how transparent are they being, or rather not being, as the case may be. And that this does, frankly, I think the Prime Minister's office thinks that this makes him look good because he is being transparent. He stood up in the House a year or so ago to tell the public that they had evidence of allegations of Indian government involvement with serious criminal activity, including murder. And so, yeah, I'm a little bit pissed off that that this is how this all played out by giving it to the Washington Post, making it look super important, yada, yada, yada. Well, in fact, the strategy behind all of this, and I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be strategy. There always has to be strategy. But that I feel a little bit deceived that the strategy was to show, look how transparent we are, rather than what it really should have been about, which was public safety.
Well, the problem with that line of thinking, though, Anne-Marie, as far as the feds are concerned, is that at the same time, the Prime Minister is talking about, well, I have seen the list of MPs and former MPs who've been implicated in the foreign interference stuff. And, it would be a good idea for the Conservative leader to step up and, pay attention to what's going on here. Not so long ago, the federal government was telling us that intelligence is not evidence. That, in fact, that's why we don't spill the beans on some of these things. And everything that's going on here has only muddied those lines. There is no clarity in terms of what's the best practice and what's the best step forward now. Because if you start leaking shit to the Washington Post or the Globe and Mail or whoever, and then in the committee meeting, dropping these stink bombs because, well, I've seen the intelligence and is the underlying theme. I don't know who you trust. I don't care how transparent you think you're being. There's no trust anymore. There's no respect for the whole process.
Yeah, I totally agree that I think that, as Brad said, they were trying to look like they were really transparent. So trust us because we're being very, very transparent. When really what they were being, it appears to be, is manipulative. They were trying to manage the story rather than protect public safety. And that's not being transparent. So I just am a flummoxed most of the day that why the Liberals keeps shooting themselves in the foot all the time. And I'm just confused why that keeps happening, but it certainly keeps happening over and over and over again. And I just wish, I wish they wouldn't, but that seems to be where we are now.
Well, I thought it was interesting, just sort of based on, self-inflicted wounds and everything. And these are, big bangs and big flashes of gunpowder and fire. This week, I saw a story that I thought, here was one that you missed the point. You actually missed an opportunity to move the ball down the field. And it came in an unusual circumstance for me, because when I looked at the story this week, it's from the Stars talking about it, and Pierre Poilievre is talking about disability programs and pensions in provinces, and what he is saying to them, the provinces that is, he wants them to overhaul their disability programs, and if they don't, he could, as Prime Minister, withhold federal money. And the point of this, Lindsay, is to say that the programs in the provinces can't claw back employment income. We're all in Ontario. So the ODSP right now, for those who live with disability and collect that pension, is about $1,300 a month. You can't get food and shelter for anything close to that in this province, in this city, never mind. So to allow somebody who is able to work to supplement that would be a benefit. And we all understand that. But the way the systems are set up, if you make too much money, we claw it back from you. It is actually institutionalized legislated poverty in Ontario. Poilievre is right in terms of how this process should work as far as the disability benefits are concerned. It sounds to me, though, like he's kind of off brand here. But I think he's actually struck one at the heart of the Liberals, because they should have fixed this when they brought in the Canada Disability Benefit. He wins on this, I think.
Mm-hmm.
This is super smart. So for all the reasons you just stated, the Liberals just got slammed by audiences and interest groups who are wanting to see real change. And it had been tipped, right? People were expecting that real change was going to happen with disability rights and funding, and it just nosedived. Huge fail. So first win for Poilievre right out of the gates is that he's countering something that the other guys didn't do well. Another thing, obviously, our healthcare in Canada is run provincially. There's only so much the feds can do. This is an amazing way to insert healthcare change that impacts a large number of Canadians coast to coast. So smart again. To your point, it's kind of an interesting brand play, but it impacts more people than we think. And when it comes to getting people back to work, I think that's squarely within the Poilievre brand. It does a lot of massaging on the outside, but I was looking at some of the numbers. There's 360,000 odd people on disability insurance in Ontario alone. There's something like 1 million or so across Canada. 10%, it said, I think these are high numbers, 10% in Ontario claim disability insurance. So it kind of begs the question of the other 90%, who of those guys could work? Many can't, but who of them could? So is there an embedded disincentive not to either claim what it is you're earning or to not work at all? That's a wonderful conservative program. So again, another win. But it also points to the fact that, to your point, that what they are receiving, what people who receive disability are getting is so below what any of them require, and is putting pressures on other systems, be it provincial healthcare, housing, et cetera, all of which are stretched. So this is a very, very smart program in my mind.
Well, Bob, the challenge is here. There's a few of them, but I think it's important for him to be bold and step out and say this out loud. The challenge here in Ontario is going to be convincing a guy like Doug Ford that he needs to be investing in this and not clawing the money back if, in fact, there are other benefits. And that was at the heart of the conversation around the Canada Disability Benefit. That, for example, the people who have disabilities aren't of equal value in provinces across the country. You might get a higher payout in Alberta than you do in Ontario, but it's way harder to qualify as a disabled person in Alberta than it is in Ontario. So there isn't any level of equity there to begin with. So there will be a challenge, just trying to have something that has a standard across the country. But he's really going to be picking fights with guys like Ford and the Premier of Alberta.
Yeah, the policy wonks are already, digging in deep on this and like, well, you can't tie federal social transfers to provincial policies. You can't do that. It hasn't been done that way. It's not set up to do that. Who cares? This is right in the political sweet spot for Poilievre because it's both good politics and good policy at the same time. It's pretty tough to argue with what he's putting forward. And to your point, Dave, about it being off brand, it's certainly off perceived brand. this is a real sorbet, a palate cleanser in Poilievre's repertoire, right? Because he's usually the angry, cranky guy who wants this cut and that cut and this shutdown and everything else. And now all of a sudden it's like, hey, we've really got to get our collective acts together to help the most vulnerable in our society. It's brilliant.
Yeah, well, I think Anne-Marie, I know you're such a fan, so I don't want to, spoil anything for you. But this is the kind of messaging I think that, as much and all as Jamil Javani and Melissa Lantsman will be the firebrands, if he were to be able to pick this up and say, this is not only why it makes sense politically and from policy, but it actually saves us money. It lifts people out of poverty without us spending more money than is already in the pot. That's a way better narrative.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is, and it's not really accurate because it's already been stated. Very few people on disability are able to work and earn an income. But that being said, I think it's all about Poilievre's image, and he has been working hard of late. You see the marketing, I see the ads everywhere about trying to change his image to a more humane person and a softer image and so forth. They tried to change his look. Every once in a while, his real fiery kind of sense, a hard ass image that he has comes out. But and then he does something like this. I can't see it working with his conservative premiers. I just don't see it working. It'll be interesting to see if he actually implements it at all, or if it was all just about softening his image, knowing it really has a little chance of being successful in the end.
Well, we can say that, as Brad, to some degree, but Trudeau has managed to handle things like the childcare, the daycare programming, and there were ways of doing that, and he's brought the Conservatives on board from a liberal perspective. But when you go back to the Canada Disability Benefit, the Liberals failed on that miserably, because the program, as Lindsay says, is targeting about 1 million people in the country. It would raise most of them out of poverty. And the cost of poverty in Canada annually is $80 billion a year. So holy cow, there's got to be an opportunity here to turn this into something and convince the Smiths and the Fords of the world that this is the right thing to do.
I just want to play devil's advocate for a second here, and to withhold or to threaten to withhold then transfer payments, whether he can do it or not. In my mind, he is using people on disability as a little bit of a political pawn, and maybe I'm missing something here, but I think that needs to be fleshed out a little bit more as well. I'm not saying that this isn't a good idea. In the end, what you say, Dave, 100%. Whether or not he can convince his fellow premiers, his fellow Tory premiers to do this, I have no idea. But it comes with I'm going to withhold transfer payments if you don't, then that puts people in those situations who are collecting those benefits in a bit of a precarious state, does it not?
Well, I think yes, but at some level, we hear this argument all the time in terms of what happens with various levels of government, and that's happening here, in Toronto with the province, for example. If you aren't going to do this, then we're going to do that instead because of our relationship with you. Now, I realize that the municipalities are a creature of the province, and it's a different relationship. But I don't know who said it, if it was Bob or Lindsay, but the idea that, generally speaking, people don't give a shit. They just want to make sure housing is built. They want to make sure that the programs are delivered. And it doesn't matter who's cutting the check. You ask any average person, and I know you know this better than anybody, they'll come to you and start complaining about levels of government that have nothing to do with what you were doing when you were at the City of Toronto, right? So I get it.
100%.
But at the same time,
I want to see who's going to pull out the bike lanes, Dave, to be perfectly honest with you. I want to see how that plays out. I want to see Olivia Chow laying down in front of a bulldozer.
Well, on that, somebody today was saying, where is the mayor on this? She's been a little quiet, but I don't want to get off track on it. But
they have a special relationship, though, Dave. There's a lot of special elements to that
Special
relationship.
that's going on there. Indeed.
Special.
But just to Brad's point for a hot second, Brad, is what you're saying that Poilievre has chosen this issue of disability as just as it is and as important as it is, it becomes almost his pet project. So, insert any other pet project that he could threaten the provinces with. Is that what you're playing devil's advocate for? Is to say, like, why this issue and not the litany of other items on the health agenda?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm being maybe I'm being too much of a cynic and not enough of a skeptic. That it's a talker, obviously, right, as they say. And so he's going to get a headline today, and whether it ever becomes an actual issue in the election, I don't know. I doubt it. But I just wonder, I think about somebody who might be collecting a disability check and reading this and worrying now that that withholding transfer payments to the province may mean that they don't get their check at the end of the month because there's some squabble between the feds and the province, and becomes an issue of federalism or some nonsense.
Yeah, well, I think the challenge is right now, if you ask anybody who's on a disability plan, that whatever the provinces are coughing up is a hairball more than anything. So anything that improves that for them, they're going to be in good shape. Love this piece from the editorial board at the Globe and Mail this week, and it kind of caught my ear and eye because the question of COVID has kind of gone quiet. The discussion around COVID-19 has gone quiet. And I was listening to a podcast, and Malcolm Gladwell was on, and it was Chris Cuomo was interviewing him, and they were talking about the absence of COVID-19 being part of the campaign narrative in the United States. They just aren't talking about it. And then I saw this piece in the Globe, and the lessons of the pandemic, which we all thought, we're going to learn lessons from the pandemic. We better implement them because next time we're going to be ready. Well, the suggestion is we weren't ready after the HIV epidemic. We weren't ready after the SARS epidemic. And we should have learned lessons in those cases. And we should have learned lessons certainly from SARS that we should have applied to the situation with COVID. And Bob, I don't get a sense that anybody's got any fire under their ass about making sure that, okay, where's the reckoning here, with the exception of, the economy's back and standing up and we're all good.
Yeah, it really is interesting because it wasn't that long ago now, right? We're only, 4 years since the depths of this thing, when we didn't know what the hell was going to come at us next. And for something that cataclysmic, there really ought to be, and kudos to the Globe editorial board for highlighting this, because we really do need to learn those lessons, and we really do need to entrench some of the principles that worked and that helped manage an unimaginable situation in real time. They were building that plane in the sky, and they got some things really wrong, but they got a lot of things right. And there is tremendous value in that. I think politically, it's an anathema to want to focus on that, to want to go back to want to raise any of the things that can be still so polarizing about that collective experience that we all had, and probably best just to sort of leave it behind. But at the very least, man, I hope the policy wonks are paying attention and are going to do some unsexy, probably behind the scenes work to implement some of those recommendations.
Well, and this would have been just after, I guess, Eves would have been the premier during SARS, and there was that report that came out. And here are the bullet points and a long list of things, and none of them seemed unreasonable. When you look at it in the rear view mirror. So I get the point where, politically, is this going to be risky? What's risky about it?
I think I understand why they don't implement the lessons. The lessons aren't forgotten, they're there, but they all cost money. the stockpiling, you have to practice your pandemic. You have to make an investment in pandemic planning in order to keep the institutional knowledge and memory and the memory muscle alive. And most people don't do that. It costs money. When the pandemic happened, Ontario's stockpiles were all old and weren't usable because they didn't invest in it year over year over year. It's expensive, and that's why governments don't do it.
Well, and the stockpiles might have been, old and obsolete, Lindsay, but the other side of it is also our sense of preparedness in terms of who holds the pen on this now. I mean, it was even that kind of stuff, right? What do we do about the schools? What do we do about the air filters and all those sorts of things? While we were all running off, I don't know why, but buying toilet paper, that seemed to be the priority instead of kind of nailing it down. Just even pulling out, well, what happened in SARS? Is there something we could have actually implemented right away? There didn't seem to be any of that then.
Right. And the article, like, I want to echo what Bob said. Kudos to the editorial board, and they need to keep pushing on this. The article points to how, we have 13 different healthcare institutions in the country. Each, if you think back, and it's hard because I think we've all cut that part of our brain out for survival's sake. But remember how our maritime provinces wouldn't let us in? Do you remember how Toronto was the most shut down capital in the world? In the world. Like, that's incredible. Our borders were shut down. We had no means of getting PE other than waiting and waiting and waiting. We were yellow taping up our play yards. The inconsistency around how the provinces managed it, how we communicated, how, bless them, our provincial healthcare officials and city healthcare officials communicated, it was all over the map. So, like, are we ready? Is our readiness plan there? And I don't mean on paper. I mean what Emery's getting at. Like, do we have the stockpiles? Do we have the infrastructure to build what we need to build? Is there some sort of consistency across the country? What happened to our long-term care homes, right? Like, over 40% of all the folks who died came from there. What happened? And my kind of communications hat worry with all of this is that there was so much fear before. Even if you were an anti-vaxxer or you weren't a believer, you had concerns, you went with the flow, especially at the beginning. My real concern is that should something happen again, especially if it's within a yard's throw of where we are now in our growing history, will there be an appetite to adhere to rules, to listen? I find it very hard to believe that it would right now. And without consistency, I think for that reason alone, it's very troubling.
Yeah, the baked in cynicism and the distrust, the disinformation that came and was born out of the circumstances of the pandemic, it just became a petri dish for that kind of stuff, Brad. But even to Lindsay's point, I challenge anybody on this in the show right now, or listening or watching, to tell me where you can get a COVID test. The tests for the current strain. You can't. Well, yeah, I guess you could go to an ER.
I've been to hospitals. I'm one of my clients, a hospital right now, and they're out of date. So they're any ones that folks are getting are old. You can't.
They're not reliable.
I'm speaking to Ontario. I can't speak for other provinces, but
you could buy them. You can buy them.
I think Vladimir Putin has.
They don't test for the current strain.
Yeah, they're out of date.
That's true.
Look, I was the chief communications officer at the City of Toronto.
They get at least 10 points.
Yeah, well, Trump, I was the chief communications officer at the City of Toronto when this pandemic was declared. And I can tell you that you talk about building a plane when it's flying, with Matt Pegg, with Eileen Davila, with John Tory, with Joe Cressy, the city manager at the time. We met and held pressers daily. I mean, the comms was the focus in the early going, because this virus was so unknown. And that's why we were putting, yellow tape around playgrounds, and benches were bad, and developing graphics that said stay 6 feet apart, or the length of a hockey stick, or whatever, right? So the staying at home, and people learning to bake sourdough bread, and watching Friends all over again, all of that lockdown stuff. Nobody wants to go back there and think of that and remember that, especially in the early going, and then all the open, close, and that's where a lot of the frustration came, and that's where we started to see a lot of the protests. And I'll just leave it at this, and say that Toronto, though, in the end, had the most successful vaccination campaign in the world. So, people did their level best, and we really, took it, the vast majority really took it seriously. And when the vaccine came out, they went and got it, because fuck that. I don't want to be stuck at home anymore. I want to be protected. And we can leave all the vaccination politics aside for a second. But
we also had the lowest death
unknowns.
rate. We also had Canada had the lowest death rate, one of the lowest death rate, if not the lowest. So we did some things right.
Toronto,
it may look like we fucked up.
Brad, you and your team aced it. It was a phenomenal effort.
We had this city of Toronto's, thank you. The city of Toronto's long-term care homes had not that this is a measure that you really want to boast, but I guess if you have to, you can. Of all the long-term care homes, Toronto only had 10. But also the lowest death rate. So say that, you can take that away and slice and dice that as to why that may have been. But the Toronto Public Service, the vast majority of whom worked every day. They were out there picking up your garbage. The public health nurses were out there doing their jobs. There are lots of lessons to be learned, I think, from a health policy perspective, for sure. But in terms of response, I think Canadians should be proud of how they responded, certainly in the initial goings. Perhaps later, and then we saw in Ottawa, perhaps not so much. But I think overall, lots of lessons to be learned for sure, but I think ultimately a net positive.
But and I think Brad makes the point really eloquently and literally, Bob. There's a level of fatigue that has baked into our response post-COVID. Like, enough. We worked hard. We did our thing. We did the best we could do, and the whole question around revisiting lessons triggers us. And I say that with all due respect. I think we're all so bloody tired of it, and we may not be willing to admit it, but I think that the fatigue post-COVID is a part of why we don't want to get back into it again.
Oh, absolutely. As Lindsay said, we've all collectively cut that part of our brains out because we just don't even want to think back to it and have to revisit those things. But back to the point of the Globe and Mail editorial, we have to revisit some things, if only to be ready for the next go around. So it's not a popular conversation. It's not one anybody wants to have, but it is necessary.
Well, okay, let's leave it there. Bob Reid, thanks for being here this week. Brad Ross and Anne-Marie Aikens, and of course, Lindsay Broadhead, part of the CA.S.T, our communications and strategy team here at Now and Next. And we didn't get to it, but I would suggest that you pick up the Star and read Anne-Marie's piece on why mega infrastructure projects don't work. And my sense is that, mega infrastructure and mandates don't match. So that's a kind of a critical part of the agenda as far as we move forward. And in particular, when we start talking about, bigger political issues, that the infrastructure is going to be an important part of that discussion. All right, that'll do it for us. It is Now and Next here for Story Studio Network. And just a reminder, we'll also have in the feed On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And this, as of late now, Tim Hudak and Kathleen Wynne are part of that co-host panel. So if you haven't checked it out, do so and leave us a comment. I'm noticing a lot of you like to comment on the YouTube. I would encourage you to get past the headline, though, when you comment. Feel free to listen. I know some of you have, because I can tell by the comments, but there's lots of the comments now. You're just reading the headline. There's good content. And if you've listened this long, you will have known that. All right. I'm Dave Trafford. It's Now and Next for Story Studio Network.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is Story Studio Network's flagship podcast, produced by our chief executive producer, Dave Trafford, and supported by our entire SSN team, including our senior producers, Becky Coles and Jen Hudson, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler. Jamie Nickerson is our production manager, and our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Also, I'm Erin Trafford, Queen of the Universe.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.